So I have another Cummins engine in here with EGR issues, and I'm going to take it apart and show you each component and what's happening to it, and try to diagnose what's causing the abnormal EGR rate. But right off the bat, as you can see, this is the intake housing, and there is just a ton of oil in there, and that is coming from the turbo. And so the turbo is passing oil into the air intake, and that's what's causing the EGR problems. Ultimately, is that the turbo's oil passing into the intake is gunking up the soot and causing it to cause problems in your EGR. This is your EGR valve, and so as you can see, there's some problems which are resulting from the turbo passing oil. But we're going to take it apart and diagnose what part in here is failing and causing the problem. So the first thing I've done here to prepare to take apart this EGR system is I took off the intake hose from the charger cooler to the intake housing to make sure I can get that off and get some more room. There it is there, dangling down. That's step one. Two, I took off this hot pipe, what they call it, which goes from the EGR cooler here. The exhaust gas flows through here to this side. I take the 10mm bolts off of the EGR cooler, 10mm bolts off the front of the EGR valve. These come most of the time with two rubber gaskets right here on the end of those bolts, and those are reusable, so you could take this off usually without worrying about having to replace gaskets and stuff. So you remove that hot pipe, which also has a little clamp here that clamps it to the front of the engine. You have to remove that and those pipes so that I can next remove this EGR valve. And so this EGR valve has this plug here, which is again is a pull lock. You pull the lock out and then you push down on that and remove that. Sometimes I have to pry on it a little bit. And then it's just 4 10mm bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4. And once you have those 4 10mm bolts loosened up, you just pry this thing right off. And again, on this one, you have a gasket on here, this silver gasket, and 9 times out of 10, I'm able to reuse it. But you see already the amount of gunk and soot that's mixed with oil that is coking up this EGR valve. And so we're going to inspect that and see if it's leaking, sticking open, causing our problem. Next on the list is going to be the delta P sensor, and then the intake housing itself, which is basically just another bunch of 10mm bolts. 2 on the delta P sensor, and then 6 on the housing. 1, 2, 3 up top, and then there's 1, 2, 3 down below. So I'll take that off in just a second. Now here's the removal of the delta P sensor. I already removed the connector, just a lock and a clip. 2 10mm bolts, pull this off, and here you have the delta P sensor with 2 ports with those green rubber O-rings, which are reusable. Just 2 things to note on this is that a lot of times you'll pull this off and there will be moisture and soot buildup in these 2 ports on the sensor itself. That's normal. You see that all the time. 9 times out of 10, you don't need to worry about that. It's just the moisture from the difference of temperatures and pressures in the system. The other thing is that these ports should be cleaned on a fairly regular basis and checked. These often will plug up. I have another video for cleaning that out. But these ports you'll want to check and make sure that they are clear and soot-free. This port you can't get in there from this angle. You actually have to remove this housing in order to get through there through a port in the backside, which again, I have another video on EGR differential pressure that you can watch to see that. All right, last on the list is this air intake housing. So you have a harness here with the red locking clip. Push that out, push that down, pull that off. And then you have your 6 bolts up top, which I already removed. 5 out of the 6. The 3 long ones go on the top. The 3 short ones go on the bottom. I usually have to use a magnet to get these last ones out, so I just wanted to show you how I do that. Okay, so once you have those removed, this also has a gasket that is normally, I can reuse it, but out of all of them, this one is oftentimes the one that will need to be replaced, but we'll see. So you just kind of lift up, get it separated from that gasket, and then pull straight out towards you. Oh yeah, and you could see how bad this oil has been damaging this system. This is your air intake heater. This is when, if the weather's cold outside, this is like a heater grid that heats up and warms up your intake air. And look at how built up the oil and the gunk and the soot is on here. And here's that gasket I was talking about. It did rip, so I'm gonna have to replace this gasket. But this is the intake air housing gasket. And so we're gonna have to clean all this up. This will also throw a code if it gets, I'm surprised it's not already, but when the heater turns on to heat this, if this buildup's causing a short in the system, it'll throw a code for your air intake heater. So we're gonna clean this up. We're gonna clean this housing up. As you can see, it is messed up. And we're gonna clean up the rest of the system. And then I'm gonna take you and show you the inside of the EGR cooler to see how that looks. We might have to remove that and clean it as well. So I have all the components of the EGR system off, except for the most difficult one, the EGR cooler itself, which is this component here. So we're gonna look in the front of this hole to see whether or not we think this EGR cooler needs to be removed and cleaned or replaced if we can't clean it. So here we go, let's take a look inside. Oh yeah. As you can see, much like a radiator or a condenser, evaporator, those kind of systems with the fins and tubes, this thing is blocked up. And if the airflow, the EGR flow, can't flow through this, it's going to be not having the flow that it's supposed to, and it's going to be throwing these codes. What we're going to do is we're going to remove this EGR cooler as well. And since I already have the coolant drained, it's going to be helpful to removing this. I'll show you how. I'm going to do that next. So here's what you need to remove your EGR cooler. Basically, I have here 9/16 socket and a ratchet, or you could use a wrench to remove these coolant line banjo fittings. You just pop these two off and you get this line out of your way. This is connected to the EGR cooler by this 8mm bolt, and there's another one down here. All I have is a 1/4-inch drive and a deep well socket 8mm ratchet. Get those off. Those are your two coolant lines going to the EGR cooler. You pop those out once you have those bolts undone. Then up here, you have a 10mm bolt that's holding it in place here. You have a 10mm bolt that's holding it in place here. You see it how quickly that was. I got all those done in 5 minutes. The hardest part about this is where the exhaust pipe mounts in the back. There's a bolt right here and there's a bolt right there. Those are 1/2-inch bolts. Sometimes those can be a little bit rusted or stuck in there well. I'll use my impact gun on those to get those out. Might need to use some lubricant or some heat up the bolts right here to get them loose. But those are going to be your hardest things. 1/2-inch socket, impact gun. You can get it back there if you try. And then there's these hard gaskets that are in between here. You hang on to those and we'll pop that off. But after that, you can pull this thing right out. Be mindful of these banjo fitting bolts. They have O-ring washer on the top and one on the bottom to make sure you don't lose those. So these rear bolts busted out of there real easy, so that was nice. But as you can see, I can get my gun in there. Just pop those ones loose. That one, they got the spacer on there. Make sure you keep that. This other one's already loose. See if I could get it out by hand. Alright, we got both of those. Like I said, these metal gaskets you want to make sure you hold on to. Put those with the rest of that stuff there. And now, I pulled the pipes loose after removing those 8mm bolts. Now we're just going to lift this thing up and out. There it is. Pretty simple once you've done a few and you get the hang of it. The hardest part is really draining the coolant. Okay, so I basically have the whole EGR system laid out right here. Your EGR valve on the right, your EGR cooler, your intake housing with your Delta P port mount right here, and your EGR valve mount right here, then your Delta P sensor. So here's what I'm looking for on each one. This is that Delta P port I was telling you about, which I have in the other video. There's this little plug with the 4mm Allen key that I take out of there. And this is the only way you can get to this port because this port runs perpendicular to the top. So I take something sharp and skinny and I put it in here and I'm checking for resistance to see if there's soot buildup. And what you should be able to see, as you can see, is your tool go all the way through. That means that plug, that port is not plugged up. So we got a clean port there. That's not the cause of our EGR system problems. Secondly, let's come to the EGR valve. What I do is, you see how it has the 2 ports on this side and then the one up top. Well, this is where your EGR air comes in, and then the valve works this way and that to close and open these 2 ports. Well, there should not be any gases getting through either port when it's closed in the closed position. So what I'll do is I'll use a little solution I have and I pour it into this top port with the EGR valve sitting up like this. What I'm looking for is to see if there's any fluid coming into these ports. As you can see, there is. The fluid that I poured in here is leaking into these ports when it's not supposed to be. That means that EGR valve is sticking open a little bit and we need to correct that. Here's the thing, because this system is so gunked up and so messed up, that is a problem, but it's probably not the only problem. So that's why I take the whole thing apart and just clean it and inspect it all. And then finally, as you guys have already seen, there's the EGR cooler, which is extremely gunked up, and we're gonna clean that up. And what I usually do is I just take something, you could take a piece of plastic, whatever, and block off this side, I'll use the bolts to bolt this on after I put some holes in it or something. And then I'll just lift it up and fill it with some kind of cleaning solvent. If you have a parts washer, you can use that. Brake clean, other type of soot, deteriorating chemicals. And I'll let that soak. I'll use, like I said, the parts washer to push fluid through it. I'll even use compressed air, whatever necessary to get that as clean as possible. So I'll show you some before and afters after I clean these all up. All right, so I got most everything cleaned up and I'm gonna go back together with it. As you can see, I cleaned up that intake heater. I put a new gasket on there, which the part number for that gasket will be in the video. And now after I cleaned up my intake housing, I'm gonna slide this right in here like so. Carefully. It's kind of hard to do when you're holding the camera with one hand and trying to slide it in. Make sure you don't disturb that gasket. Now that I got it in there, I'll start those bolts. Next thing I'm going to put on is this EGR valve. Before I did, I cleaned it all up and I wanted to do another leak test on it. So I filled up that compartment, and as you can see, very little to no water coming through, liquid coming through. So that corrected that problem. And after this, just the Delta P sensor and the EGR cooler. Alright, here we are. I have the EGR valve mounted and the Delta P sensor mounted. Just a couple of things to remember is on the Delta P sensor, remember your green O-rings, make sure they're seated correctly, that you don't tighten that down too much. Your EGR valve, just loosely put the bolts in there until you get the pipe connected. And then finally, don't forget your little plug in the back of this air housing, because if you don't, you're going to have to take out the whole housing again in order to get that plug back in there. And the housing bolts, these 3 long ones and then the 3 short ones in the back, you'll want to tighten those down prior to putting the EGR valve on, because once you do, you won't be able to get to those bolts anymore. So here we are. I got the EGR cooler cleaned out to the best of my ability, but it was really pretty difficult. That soot and gunk builds up on there, and you can still see that there's some spots on the face of this that are still built up, and it's hardened soot. And even though I soaked it overnight, and I even used a pressure washer, which might not be recommended, but still couldn't get all that soot out. And so here's this. I'll turn on a light in the back. I don't know if you could see that, but you see how you could see the light coming through. So I mean, there's some decent flow, so you got to kind of make a judgment call as to whether you want to replace this or try to run it again. We're going to replace it because you just don't know how much is caked up in between the front and the back. And if I'm just having trouble cleaning the face of this thing, then most likely going to be more problems. But if you have this model, there's the part number there for replacing it. And that's what we're going to do, and then put it back together. All right, here we go. Finally, I have the old EGR put on there, the EGR cooler, because depending on the availability of parts, if we can't get a new one within a decent amount of time, we're going to just go ahead and reuse this old one. So I just have it placed in there. Everything's loose, You know, it's always recommended to replace all your O-rings for these pipes, these banjo fittings. I mean, even these rubber gaskets, these are reusable. The metal gaskets in the back for here. But basically that's it. I leave everything loose. The EGR valve bolts, so that this crossover pipe is easy to connect to the EGR valve and the EGR cooler. But that's it. Now it's cleaned up. We're going to put it back together and run it and let it go.